Well, hello and a good Lord's Day to you all. As you can probably tell from the title of this video, why should you read the Puritans? Why are they worth reading? And I think there's a lot that I could say. But first, maybe there's that question of who are the Puritans? And I think I'm not the most qualified person to really say who they are. There's quite a few videos out actually. So there's one that came to my attention. It's by Reformation Heritage Books. They released this 2-hour long documentary about who the Puritans are. So if I could show that to you. Here, it's 2 hours long. It's honestly worth the 2 hours. They give you a great overview of the history of the Puritans. And I just found that it was great because it's historical, but also talks about, why the Puritans were just so good. But if I were to give you like a very brief overview of who the Puritans were, they were basically people who wanted to keep the Reformation going. They were reforming after the Reformation. So generally the period the Puritans is regarded as somewhere in 1560 until about the end of the 17th century, so around 1690. There's no like true official end because there are some people who still count as Puritan, so like Jonathan Edwards or even Charles Spurgeon and the last Puritan, so to speak, Martin Lloyd-Jones. They are Puritans in spirit, but in terms of the actual Puritan age, it seems like it was about 1560 to about 1690, somewhere there. And the Puritans could be described as zealous Christians. They were, almost as if we look at today, like Christians that are very, very holy, almost like too fundamental. But they were zealous Christians. They wanted to build up God's church, and they truly valued God's word. It's very evident in their readings. As you read the Puritans, you just see there's so many scripture quotations. It's amazing because they lived before an age where phones existed. So if I was thinking of that verse, I don't know, but they just quote it. And they have many references, not just one. They make a point, and here's a couple different quotations of where can you find support for this point in the Bible. So they really did know their Bible. And here maybe I have to make an appeal, even the concept of reading. What value is reading today? Because everything is just, you go on your phone, there's instant entertainment, right? Very quick. So like Instagram, TikTok, it's just, our attention span is just so low now. But reading, if you're working through a book, a book like maybe this thick, it'll take you a while. And much more than that, the Puritans are harder than your standard kind of Christian material to some extent. Like systematic theology might be a little bit tougher, but in terms of like what the average Christian reads, I think the Puritans are a little bit on the difficult side, but they are worth reading, and especially because they're an older kind of work. So there's a lot of contemporary works, a lot of great works today that are produced. I wouldn't say just ditch the contemporary stuff, but the Puritans are just from a couple hundred years ago. But the truths they spoke are as relevant as they were back then as they are today. And I heard this from one of the Founders Conference panels. I believe it was, if something is new, it's probably not true. And if it's true, it's probably not new. So the Puritans, they're definitely not new. But all that they've written, they've just written such wonderful, wonderful truth. And, they have all this knowledge of the Bible. They can explain it to you intellectually. They can tell you all the nuances of how to apply it into your life. Yet, they do it in such a way that it affects your hearts. It's not just like intellectual knowledge, but they show you the beauty of it They show you the application of it. How do you use this knowledge that they've just taught you? And how does it apply in your life? And what you'll find is, the Puritans, they wanted God's people to be holy. They themselves sought to be very holy. And though they are hard on sin, it's good to be hard on sin. They're even stronger on Christ, stronger on grace and God's goodness. They will make you feel guilty. A lot of their works, as you read it, you find, you just focus on yourself like, oh, I definitely do not meet God's standards. But sometimes I think if we read the more contemporary books, it gives us room to sort of look at someone else and criticize them a little bit. Not all contemporary works do that, but in terms of how the Puritans wrote these things, it really causes you to look at yourself, do a little bit of introspection, not morbid introspection, but a healthy amount of introspection, but then look to Christ instead. Once you see your need, your sinfulness, look at the greater need that Christ provides for you. So that's why I think the Puritans are really just so wonderful. I think there's another great point of how the Puritans wrote quite a bit on suffering. So I'm going to show a couple books later, but the Puritans knew how to suffer well. So they understood suffering. They understood how the Bible talked about suffering, and they prepared you for it. They offered you truths, in times of suffering. Where do you go? Where do you go in the Bible? What truths do you remember about God? And how do they comfort you during this time of suffering? Now, I know that they are a little bit difficult to read. There are challenges. So I do think that the Puritans are a little bit of a acquired taste. So some of the words they use, you'll find me just Googling, what does this word mean? So if I were to show you here, penury, definition. There it says extreme poverty. Or how about this word? Requits, I guess. I hope I pronounced that right. I have a habit of pronouncing words wrong. But avenge or revenge, this is just a tip of the iceberg. I've certainly searched more than just 2 words of this word meaning. This word meaning. I have many tabs I've closed now of this word meaning. So some of their words, their language is a little bit old. I don't think their grammar is too bad. As you start to read more, they're manageable. But some of their points, like the depth of their points, some specific authors, they manage to go from this one verse and they just go into all the nuances of it. And I think, sometimes it is hard. Like you see, oh yes, this is a good application. But this one, that's a little over my head, really. So the depth of their points, it is rich. It takes time to really think over it and digest it. Maybe you have to reread it once or twice, 3 times, maybe more even. And again, it goes to, as I mentioned, reading takes concentration. We have to train our attention spans again, but it is well worth it because the Puritans, they just have so much to offer us today. People who suffered well, and today we can see there's just all kinds of suffering that I think could be avoided or mitigated to an extent if we understood as Christians, this is how God works. Yes, there's affliction, but that's not the end of the world for the Christian. God can use affliction for good. We see that in the Bible, and in the Puritan writings, it's a common theme as well. So perhaps here, where to start? Where should you start if you have an interest in Puritan writings? And if you wanted a longer video, I'm hoping to keep this video relatively short, but there is another video. Initially, when I came up with this idea of why should you read the Puritan writings, I was like, oh, there's like no one has made a video like this. I YouTube searched it, no videos. But then, to my great dismay, there was this breakout session by Joelbeeke. They had a Puritan Conference, believe it or not. I was unaware. So here he gives his basically an hour-long version of what I'm trying to do here, and he does a great job of recommending, even who they are, his background with them, and who to start with, who not to start with. I do recommend watching the video actually, because Joel Beeke, he's so well versed in who the Puritans are. So he mentions that he started at the age of 9. His grandfather had Puritans just on the bookshelf. So at the age of 9, I think curiosity overtook him and he started reading one. And then by the age of 16 or 17, he had devoured his grandfather's library, read up all those Puritans. So he's read far more Puritans than I have. So in terms of who you should trust Joel Beeke. And he's wonderful in terms of, just the work he's done for the Puritans and the works that he's continuing to publish. So very grateful to him for that. But where should you start? Well, if you find a language a little bit too hard today, there is actually a modernized version. So Joel Beeke, he does mention this as well. But here, there's this series called Puritans for Today. The titles do seem a little bit different from the titles that I've read. So I'm actually not quite familiar with some of these works. But the principle behind these works is that several men have read the original works and then they've modernized it. They've reworked the grammar and the language so that it sounds as if it was a book written yesterday. So for those who are trying to get into reading the Puritans, getting their feet wet, Puritan Treasures for Today, that might actually be a good way to get into reading the Puritans. So I can't fully recommend it because I actually haven't gone down that route myself. As a seminary student, I just sort of jumped straight into the deep end and read the Puritans. Personally, I think maybe the first book I ever read from the Puritans was this one here, Keeping the Heart. And a friend of mine recommended it to me. So that's by Johnflavel. And I was like, oh, I have that book, so why don't I take a read? And I think I just powered my way through it because it was a little bit difficult. But from there, I was like, this is really good content. I was quite amazed by it. And I thought, the Puritans are worth reading. So I think the next two that I probably read were this one here, Josiah's Reformation, and The Mystery of Providence. This one is also by Johnflavel. So, 2 other great books. And if I were to recommend you which books to start with, Flavel was great because he worked in a town that had a lot of sailors and fishermen. So he couldn't preach over their heads. So he makes his points very clear. He uses simple language in a way that the common person would be able to understand. So Flavel, he's a good one to start with. My personal recommendation is any Thomas. So there's Thomasbrooks, there's Thomas Goodwin, there's Thomas Boston, and there's Thomas Watson. 4 Thomases. Joel Beeke, though, he does not recommend Thomas Goodwin. So I'm not too sure if I can say that go with the Thomas and you won't go wrong. Because Thomas Goodwin was apparently quite a smart man. So the one I've read from him is The Heart of Christ. This one, it talks about Christ's heart for his disciples. And now, even though he's farther away now, his heart towards his disciples, you and I included, has not changed. So that was a great work. This one is relatively short too. Looks like it's about 150, 160 pages. The other book that I have from him, I have not read this one, but Christ Set Forth. I was taking a quick look through it. It does look a little bit harder, so I'm not sure if I can stand by the recommendation of go and read a Thomas. Thomas Boston has been very good. So Crook in a lot. It's talking about how God uses that thorn in your side, how he uses your weaknesses to shape you more into Christ. But my favorite, well, perhaps before I get into my favorite, Thomas Watson is also very good. He has one that I have, All Things for Good. Here he focuses on Romans 8:28. Talks about how all things work for good, who are called according to his purpose. And just from that one verse, he writes this little book with lots of applications from each part of the verse. But as I was saying, my favorite, it has to be Thomas Brooks. This is not Joel Beeke's favorite, but it's my favorite. Thomas Brooks, I think, is just a wonderful writer. This was probably the first one I've read by him. The Secret Key to Heaven, The Vital Importance of Private Prayer. And what you find with Thomas Brooks is that the way he writes, it's clear, and he just uses like the best illustrations to really highlight those points. Like any of those even small points, he knows what to reference from history. Like, I don't know how he does it. He's just so well read, but so readable at the same time. So perhaps if you want to grow in prayer, I will do a book review on this one as well in the future. But The Secret Key to Heaven, Thomas Brooks just makes such a good case for, that importance of private prayer and how that's something that we'll only have in this life. From his works, they've separated it, so this is just part of his works. There's also an ark for all of God's Noahs. Great title already, but there's shelter. There's shelter for every Christian. And his other one is The Unsearchable Riches of Christ. I think those are probably his better known parts of his works, but they're all just so rich and such a balm to the soul. So my personal recommendation is go with a Thomas, but especially Thomas Brooks. He's just phenomenal. As for those who are hard, or maybe before I get to those who are hard, I think John Bunyan is another good one. So if you saw my previous book review, there was The Jerusalem Sinner Saved. This is great gospel-centered book. He just goes off of Luke 24:47, talks about why he tells his disciples to preach the gospel to Jerusalem first. The most wicked city, they need the gospel the most. So that's a relatively short read, not too long, about 120 something pages. There's a Heavenly Footman. This is a very short read. This is like 73 pages. But if you needed encouragement about, running the race of faith, really running towards heaven and leaving things behind, that's a good book as well. And the one I'm working through right now is Come and Welcome to Jesus Christ. I referenced part of this material today in a short message I gave. But he's just so good. He just makes his case, such a strong case for why everyone should go to Christ. He will not turn you away. So John Bunyan, he's great as well. And then some other ones that I've read recently. So Facing Grief, that's also Johnflavel. This is also very relevant for us today. He originally wrote it to those who either lost, a spouse died, or a child passed away. So he's giving biblical wisdom on how to face grief well. Bruised Reed by Richard Sibbes, another great book. Even though, you might have so much weakness, God, he will not cast you away. Though there's so much, unpleasant things in you, God still sees the best in you. So he will not cast you away. And this book was quite especially good. You've probably seen me reference this. The Rare Jewel of Christian Contentment. So contentment is just such a lost art, if I could say it that way. Who is truly content today in a materialistic age? And I could give you a little bit of a taste of it. There's an analogy of, between a Christian suffering and a non-Christian suffering. So a Christian, you can imagine if he's like a glass, he's full of water. If you hit it, he won't make a sound. So when a Christian suffers, he will not murmur, he won't complain, he won't grumble. He understands that God can use it for his good. And he understands that his greatest joy is in God, first and foremost. But for the non-Christian, he's like an empty glass. And when you hit it, it makes a loud noise. And likewise, when non-Christians tend to suffer, they often complain, like, why is this happening to me? I need this thing if I want to be happy. I must have this. I cannot get through life if I do not have this thing, every single week. There's no reason for me to make it through life. So he really talks about the great value of Christian contentment and how that's such a good part of Christian witness. So there is a lot more that I could say, You can see behind me there that my bookshelf, it's a bit slanted. I've taken all these books and brought them over here just so I could show it for the camera. But I hope that there is some interest in these books. If there are Puritans that I would advise, waiting a little bit, go through like the easier ones first. I think Owen might actually be one of them. Owen writes great material as well. There's like the mortification of sin. He has some other ones there which I haven't pulled out. But I do find Owen is actually hard to read. I find he's actually difficult. So if you're gonna pick up a book, if you're ready to just go all in, go for Owen. But if you do, recognize that it's not gonna be an easy read. Now perhaps you might be thinking, when should I read the Puritans? When? And I think ideally before affliction, before you suffer. That's the best time. So that way you're prepared for suffering. I believe one of the books behind me is actually Preparation for Suffering. Puritan wrote that. But what I find is that when you do go through those times of suffering, the Puritans are just such a balm in your soul. So I went through a period of weakness, and then I found that, crooking a lot, this was such a good book for me. God brought to my awareness my weaknesses, my sins, and I just burned through that book, through crooking a lot, and I understood, yes, this is how God is using, this correction to shape me. This is how, these are my inherent weaknesses, but God can use that to shape me to be more like Christ. So it was just such a balm to my soul. So even though, it's better to prepare, preventative is kind of better than responsive. But even in times of affliction, I think the Puritans are even sweeter. They unwrap God's word to you. They make it just so rich. You might read a sentence in the Bible and you say, okay, here's a point you can make. The Puritans make like 10 or 12 points. And it's just so sweet during times of affliction. They remind you so much of God's goodness. They point you, this is how maybe you've sinned, yet God still has mercy and grace and kindness to you. So they give you strength, basically. They remind you, the promises of God, the truths of God. God will carry me through each and every trial and challenge of life. So I find that times of suffering, they are just so good. So those are my recommendations. I do plan to do a couple book reviews on the ones that I have read a little bit more recently. Some of the ones that I've read a little while back, I'll have to reread and hopefully give a great review, one that's worth watching and one that makes it, that appeals to you, one that makes you want to read it. And there are just so many topics that they can talk about. There's one other one that I read recently, The Incomparableness of God by George Swinnock. And it was a little bit more of an intellectual kind of book. But it really talks about the greatness of God, how he's incomparable to everything. And there's just so much truth. And God is just so much bigger than you could have imagined. If you thought God was just bigger and beyond your comprehension now, George Swinnock, he brings it even more. God is just incomparable to any created thing. So there's just so much that one could say. And I think I mentioned earlier, there are a couple that I'm working through right now. So there was Come and Welcome to Jesus Christ. There's also a Lifting Up of the Downcast. This one is quite thick, actually. You can see there. Quite a bit thicker, but looking forward to what he has to say. And this one I've been just going through periodically. So the Letters of Samuel Rutherford. He has quite a few good things there as well. And if I can also point your attention to, there is a Puritan Conference going on, or it just ended actually, the past weekend. So it was in Dubai, January 17th to 18th. I believe there's only one message that was uploaded so far by none other than Joel Beeke. But there's a couple other like John Piper, Sinclair Ferguson, Kevin DeYoung. Another Puritan Conference. And as a Puritan reader, oh my goodness, there's just such joy. Like, I wish I could have went, but Dubai is a little bit far. But hopefully, in due time, I will take a look at those messages. So hopefully, this has been of some help. Maybe you are a little bit inspired to read the Puritans, because what you find is after you read them, you're just so well equipped for suffering. Not that suffering, becomes the easiest thing to endure, but you understand, instead of questioning God, why, it becomes a little bit more clear of, I can see how God is using this. I can see how I'm supposed to start walking through this affliction in the right way, rather than, murmuring, complaining, or avoiding my problems. I can see how I should face it. I understand that God is using it for my good. So it really brings, the sweetness out of Romans 8:28. That one's often quoted, but in times of suffering, the Puritans have made that verse just so much more precious to me. And really, I think as you read more and more Puritan material, it does inspire you to pursue more personal holiness. They had such a high view of God that they would say, even just the tiniest sin is worse. That tiny little sin, that's worse than undergoing affliction. And that's just a bit of an amazing statement, because so few people today like to suffer, and we're just so quick to sin. But the tiniest sin is worse than affliction, even the worst afflictions. And that's just incredible and such a timely reminder. So, the Puritans, they're certainly worth reading. They're worth your time and energy, and it will encourage you in the faith. You will be better equipped to suffer well, and I think that's one of the greatest testimonies that we can have as Christians. How do you suffer well in a world that does not like to suffer? How do you pursue holiness even if others aren't willing to do it? We do it for the Lord. We do it out of love and all for Him. So, part of me is just mournful. It's like, there's just so much I could read. But, how much I keep and how long it takes to read, it's unfortunate. But, thankfully, there's time. So, slowly and surely, each book, it just makes you stronger spiritually. So the Puritans, they're just worth reading. And I hope that you read. If there's any book review in particular that you would like me to review, by all means, just let me know. I'll try to review it if I haven't read it recently. But the recent books that I've read, I hope to give full reviews on them and why you should read them. So, thank you all for watching, and hope to see you in the next video. Grace to you and peace as always.